Eliza Carter had always known that the house her grandmother Joyce had left her would be more than just a property. It was a piece of history, a place rich with memories of her childhood. Eliza had spent summers there, playing in the garden, listening to her grandmother's stories by the fireplace, and wandering through the old wooden halls that had witnessed generations of the Carter family. When Joyce passed away, Eliza was both devastated and deeply honored to inherit the house. It was more than just bricks and mortar. It was a symbol of continuity, a testament to the love and care Joyce had invested in the home over the years. As Eliza walked through the grand, slightly worn entrance of the house for the first time after the funeral, she felt the weight of her grandmother's legacy pressing down on her shoulders. The house had fallen into disrepair in recent years, but Eliza, a young architect eager to make her mark on the world, had big plans for it. She could already envision the way she would restore the old house, merging the beauty of its vintage architecture with her modern touch. She was ready to breathe new life into the home while preserving its essence, ensuring it would stand for generations to come. However, her vision for the house was met with an unexpected obstacle. Shortly after she had settled in and begun making plans for renovation, she received a letter from the local community association, an organization she had never been involved with, nor even knew much about. The letter was formal and sharp, announcing that her property was considered a disgrace to the neighborhood and needed to be demolished immediately due to its deteriorating state and outdated design. The tone of the letter was cold, almost as if the association considered her a mere nuisance rather than an individual fighting to protect a piece of her family's history. The claim was that the house violated the neighborhood's aesthetic standards, something Eliza hadn't even been aware existed. She had never received any prior warnings, nor had she been consulted about any guidelines, so the accusation felt both bewildering and unjust. Eliza had always prided herself on her work as an architect, and the idea that her home, inherited and cherished, could be reduced to a mere obstacle for developers and bureaucrats was maddening. The letter claimed that the property was now subject to the association's jurisdiction, which, according to the rules, meant they had the right to force her to demolish it. The reasoning behind this decision was tied to what they described as community aesthetics, a vague term Eliza found increasingly infuriating. She had been in the architectural field long enough to recognize when a building's integrity was being disrespected in favor of some arbitrary notion of conformity. Her grandmother's house was a classic example of a well-designed Victorian home, with ornate detailing, high ceilings, and spacious rooms, each with its own character. It was a reminder of a bygone era when craftsmanship and uniqueness mattered. For Eliza, the house was an irreplaceable treasure, a piece of her family's history, and no organization, especially one she had never joined or agreed to, could take it from her without a fight. Eliza's first instinct was to ignore the letter, to believe it was some kind of mistake. But then she realized that this wasn't just about one house. This was part of a larger trend in the neighborhood. Developers had long been eyeing the land for new projects. With the area growing increasingly popular, the local association had started pressuring homeowners to comply with new improvements that favored higher, more uniform buildings. Many residents had already sold their properties to investors eager to transform the area into something more profitable. Eliza had known there were changes happening around her, but she hadn't imagined her family's house would be caught in the crossfire. As she sat down at the kitchen table, the weight of the situation settled in. The house was more than a structure. It was part of her identity, part of her family's story. And now, not only was she being asked to let go of it, but the association was using their bureaucratic power to force her hand. The rules seemed designed to make it impossible for someone like her, someone with limited resources and without powerful connections, to fight back. They were banking on the fact that she would either comply or give up. But Eliza wasn't one to back down easily. She had inherited more than just the house. She had inherited the resilience and stubbornness of her grandmother. Joyce had fought her own battles in her time, and Eliza was determined to honor that legacy by standing her ground. She knew this wasn't going to be easy. There would be obstacles, legal hurdles, and possibly even threats to her safety. But Eliza had always believed that the things worth fighting for were never simple. As she looked around the house, imagining the life she could build here, she made up her mind. She would not let her family's home be torn down by faceless bureaucrats with no understanding of what it truly meant to her. She would fight to keep it, no matter what. The journey ahead would not just be about saving a house. It would be about standing up against a system that had grown complacent in its greed and its disregard for the value of heritage and family. Eliza had a deep sense of purpose now, a realization that her fight would be bigger than just herself. She was ready to face whatever came next, even if it meant standing alone against the weight of the entire system. Eliza had spent a sleepless night sitting at her table and rereading the letter she had received from the local homeowners association. Her hands were trembling, and her thoughts were a jumble. The house she had inherited from her grandmother, which she considered more than just a property, was now under threat. Eliza, a young architect, had worked on many projects, from modern office buildings to old houses, but none meant as much to her as the one she had inherited from Joyce. This house was not just a structure. It was filled with memories, with the stories of her childhood, summers spent in the garden, listening to her grandmother's tales by the fireplace and wandering through the old wooden halls that had witnessed generations of the Carter family. It was more than a home. It was a symbol of continuity, of her family's legacy. When Joyce passed away, Eliza felt both devastated and deeply honored to inherit it. She had big plans for the house. It needed repairs, of course, but she saw it as an opportunity to blend modern architecture with its historic charm. She envisioned a space that would honor its past while providing her with a future, a place where she could continue the family legacy. But that vision was now under serious threat. The next morning, after a restless night, Eliza opened her eyes to the letter again. The local homeowners association had sent a formal notice declaring her house an eyesore and demanding its demolition. The letter was cold, bureaucratic, and deeply upsetting. The association claimed the house violated neighborhood aesthetic standards that, until then, Eliza hadn't even known existed. The tone of the letter was dismissive, as though she were nothing more than a nuisance to be dealt with, rather than someone fighting to preserve a piece of her family's history. The letter asserted that the property was now under the jurisdiction of the association, and that they had the right to force her to demolish it. There were no previous warnings, no consultations, and no attempts to communicate these aesthetic requirements to her beforehand. For Eliza, this was not just an issue of property. It was a matter of personal legacy, of history. The house had been in her family for generations, and for the association to simply wipe that out because it didn't fit into some arbitrary standard was infuriating. The house was a Victorian masterpiece, complete with ornate detailing, high ceilings, and large windows that allowed sunlight to flood the rooms. It was a piece of architectural history, and to call it an eyesore was not just an insult to her, but to the memory of her grandmother, who had poured so much love and care into the house over the years. Eliza's first instinct was to dismiss the letter as a mistake. Surely this couldn't be real. She thought of ignoring it and moving on, but as she read the letter again, the reality of the situation hit her. This wasn't a mistake. This was an attempt to erase something important. And the more she thought about it, the more she realized that this wasn't just about her house. This was part of a much larger trend. The neighborhood had been slowly transforming over the years, with new, modern buildings replacing the old, and property values steadily climbing. The land that her house sat on was now prime real estate, and the local developers had been eyeing it for years. The Homeowners Association, which had long been in the pocket of these developers, was now using its power to push out anyone who didn't fit their vision for the area. She wasn't the first person to receive such a letter, and she wouldn't be the last. People who lived in the area, particularly those who had older homes, had been quietly coerced into selling their properties, or were simply driven out by the association's tactics. Eliza hadn't expected her grandmother's home to be targeted so soon, but it was clear now that the association was after more than just the house. It was after the land. The realization hit Eliza hard, but it also fueled her determination. She wasn't going to let them take it without a fight. She had to act quickly, but she knew that she couldn't do this alone. The first thing she did was reach out to her lawyer, David. David was not the most high-profile attorney, but he was reliable and had helped her in the past. When she explained the situation to him, he immediately advised her to check if the house had been registered as a historical landmark or if it had any protection under local preservation laws. If the house was listed as a historic building, that might help her case. If not, she would be fighting an uphill battle. David explained that she could apply for the house to be designated as a historic landmark, but that would take time she didn't have. The association had already started proceedings, and the pressure on her to comply was mounting. In the meantime, David advised Eliza to look into her grandmother's records. Joyce had always been outspoken about her disdain for the homeowners association and had refused to join when it was first formed. Maybe there were documents, letters, or agreements that could help her make her case. Eliza felt a glimmer of hope. If her grandmother had taken action years ago, she might have something that could counter the association's demands. Eliza went to the city archive the next day, determined to find anything that could prove the house was historically significant. She spent hours flipping through dusty old files and maps, hoping to uncover something that could help her fight back. Eventually, she found a letter signed by her grandmother. In it, Joyce explicitly stated that she had opted out of the Homeowners Association when it was first formed, and that she did not agree with the changes they were pushing through. Eliza was ecstatic. This was exactly what she needed. She immediately made copies of the letter and sent them to David. She believed that this document could be the key to her defense. However, when she met with David the next day, he tempered her excitement. "This is a good start," he said, "but it's not enough. The association could still argue that the property is theirs to do with as they please." Eliza's heart sank. She had hoped that this letter would be the silver bullet, but David was right. She needed more evidence. David suggested they try to contact other neighbors who might have information about the association's history and any potential misconduct. It was becoming clear that this fight was going to be much more complex than she had anticipated. As Eliza prepared for the next steps in her fight, she learned that the Homeowners Association wasn't going to back down easily. Within days, she received another notice from them, this time warning her that they would be taking her to court if she didn't comply with their demands. The stakes were higher than ever. She realized that this wasn't just about saving her house, it was about something much bigger. It was about standing up to an organization that had been operating with little accountability for far too long, and about fighting for the right to keep her family's history alive. As the days went by, Eliza's sense of urgency only grew stronger. She had expected a fight, but not on this scale. The Homeowners Association was powerful, and they weren't about to let her go without a fight. Her initial optimism had begun to wear thin as she faced the full weight of their bureaucracy and influence. Despite her best efforts to gather evidence, she had little time to prepare for what was coming. The association, sensing her resolve, started ramping up the pressure. Their first tactic was simple: intimidate her into submission. They sent repeated letters demanding that she comply with their orders, threatening legal action and financial penalties. Every time Eliza thought she had a handle on the situation, another notice arrived, reinforcing the idea that the association's demands were non-negotiable. It became clear that this wasn't just about the house. It was about a system designed to wear her down and force her to give up. And yet, Eliza was determined to prove them wrong. One morning, Eliza received a call from David. His voice was stern, and there was an edge of frustration in it that she hadn't heard before. "Eliza," he began, "we need to take this to court. The association isn't going to let up, and they've already started making moves behind the scenes to ensure that this goes their way. I found some troubling information in their paperwork that might be illegal, but we'll need to act quickly." Eliza's heart sank. She had known this battle was inevitable, but the urgency in David's voice made it feel much more immediate. It wasn't just a legal challenge anymore. It was a fight for the very existence of the home she had inherited, and with every passing moment, the stakes seemed to grow higher. "What do you need from me?" she asked, already gearing up for what was to come. David paused before responding. "We need to gather more evidence. They've already filed for demolition permits under the guise of public safety. The paperwork is fraudulent, but it's moving through the system faster than I anticipated. I'll need you to contact some of the neighbors who may have information. Specifically, I want you to find out if anyone remembers the original terms under which your grandmother refused to join the association. We may be able to argue that their entire process is flawed based on that." Eliza nodded, though David couldn't see her. Her mind was racing. She hadn't thought about the neighbors in this context, but she knew they could be crucial in strengthening her case. She had spoken to a few people here and there, but no one had been as directly involved in the events surrounding the formation of the Homeowners Association as her grandmother. Eliza realized that if she was going to stand a chance in court, she would need to find those key details. She also knew that the association would do whatever it took to silence her. The pressure was mounting, and time was running out. That afternoon, she decided to pay a visit to one of her older neighbors, Mrs. Thompson. Mrs. Thompson had lived in the area for decades and had seen the neighborhood change over the years. She was well known among the residents, and Eliza had always found her to be kind and willing to share stories about the past. Mrs. Thompson's house was just down the street, a modest but well-kept home that had been passed down through several generations. Eliza knocked on her door, and Mrs. Thompson answered with a warm smile. They exchanged pleasantries, but Eliza could see that Mrs. Thompson's eyes were filled with concern. She could sense the weight of the situation, just as Eliza felt it every time she thought about the house. "I heard about the trouble you're having with the association," Mrs. Thompson said, inviting Eliza inside. "It's a shame, Eliza. Your grandmother would be turning in her grave if she knew what was happening. You know, she always hated that organization. Back when they first started, she refused to join, and they were furious about it. But she wasn't the only one. A lot of us felt the same way." Eliza sat down at the kitchen table, feeling a wave of relief wash over her. Mrs. Thompson's words were exactly what she needed to hear. She was on the right path. "Do you remember what happened back then?" Eliza asked, her voice hopeful. "What did my grandmother do when they started this whole association?" Mrs. Thompson looked out the window, lost in thought. After a few moments, she spoke, her voice low but firm. "Your grandmother never trusted them. She said it was all about control, about making money and pushing people out of their homes. They used to send people around to make sure everyone kept their lawns neat and painted their fences the right color. But your grandmother said it was just an excuse to get people to conform. She told me that if we didn't stand up to them, they'd take over everything. She was one of the first to refuse to join, and after that, they kept their distance." Eliza listened intently, taking mental notes. This was exactly the kind of information David needed. "Did she ever tell you what she did to stop them?" she asked. Mrs. Thompson nodded. "She fought back in her own way. She didn't make a big fuss, but she made sure the association knew she wasn't going to be bullied. She spoke to other homeowners, tried to get them to see the bigger picture. And she was right, Eliza. Now look at what's happened. They're trying to take everything from people like you who actually care about the history of the neighborhood." Eliza felt a surge of determination. Her grandmother had been right all along. The association wasn't interested in preserving the character of the neighborhood. They were interested in controlling it. They wanted to erase the past and replace it with something more profitable. But Eliza wasn't going to let them, not without a fight. As Eliza left Mrs. Thompson's house, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. She would go to court, and she would use every scrap of information she could find to prove that the homeowners association was operating in bad faith. But she also knew she couldn't do it alone. She needed the support of the community, of the people who still believed in preserving the history of their neighborhood, who understood that there was more to a home than just the bricks and mortar that made it up. Eliza reached out to a few other neighbors, and to her surprise, many of them were willing to join her cause. They shared their own stories of the association's overreach and the pressure they had faced over the years to conform to their standards. With the support of her neighbors and the legal expertise of David, Eliza was ready to take the next step. The battle had just begun, but she was determined to win, no matter what it took. The stakes were high, and the road ahead was uncertain, but Eliza knew one thing for sure. She wasn't going to let the homeowners association win. Not this time. The pressure that Eliza felt from the homeowners association began to grow more intense with each passing week. The letters, the threats, the constant reminder that the clock was ticking, all served to reinforce the idea that her fight for the house was not just a legal battle, but a deeply personal one. The once familiar space, filled with memories of her grandmother's laughter and love, now felt like a battlefield. She knew she had to act fast or lose everything. But every attempt to move the case forward seemed to come with new complications. As her lawyer, David, dug deeper into the association's records, he uncovered something far more troubling than they had anticipated. The homeowners association, it seemed, was not only acting under the guise of aesthetic regulations. There were whispers and hints of corruption, of underhanded deals with developers, and of systematic manipulation of the property market for profit. What had started as a seemingly straightforward legal issue about preserving a house was now entangled in something much darker. Eliza's resolve was beginning to crack. It wasn't just the constant pressure from the association that was wearing her down. It was the realization that her grandmother's refusal to join the homeowners association all those years ago had been a warning, a prescient act of defiance against a much more powerful machine than Eliza had ever understood. The association wasn't just a local body that cared about grass lengths and paint colors. It was a force in the town, pulling strings and manipulating the future of entire neighborhoods. As David's investigations into the financials and dealings of the association continued, it became clear that the people running it had ties to several developers, real estate investors, and other corporate entities that were working together to push out the original residents of the area. The association's agenda was not merely to preserve the neighborhood's aesthetic, but to reshape it, transforming old homes into high-rise buildings and modern structures that could be sold for a premium price. Eliza wasn't just fighting for her home. She was fighting for the very soul of the community that her grandmother had helped build and preserve. One afternoon, as Eliza sat in her office reviewing some of the documents David had sent her, her phone rang. It was David, and his tone was different. "Eliza, I found something that could change everything," he said. "But it's not going to be easy. You're going to have to make a decision. The association's been doing more than just ignoring your grandmother's opt-out. They've been using a loophole in the zoning laws to systematically devalue properties in this area, making it easier for them to buy them out at a fraction of the market price. They've done it before with other properties, and I've got evidence of that. This is a bigger conspiracy than I thought." Eliza's heart skipped a beat. What David was suggesting was far more than a simple case of legal maneuvering. This was outright manipulation of the real estate market for profit. She could already imagine the consequences. How many families had been pushed out of their homes in the name of progress? How many stories, memories, and histories had been erased for the sake of new developments? And now her home was next. She couldn't believe it. The fight she thought she was having wasn't just about her own inheritance. It was about the loss of so many homes, so many lives, wrapped up in the guise of improvement. "I want to see the evidence," Eliza said, her voice steady despite the rising panic inside her. David hesitated for a moment. "There's more. The association has started moving forward with the demolition order. They're trying to get your property officially condemned and they've arranged for a team of contractors to begin assessing the house for demolition. They're doing this behind your back, and it's all under the radar. If we don't stop them now, they'll have the legal grounds to tear it down in a matter of days." The shock of the news hit Eliza like a punch to the gut. It wasn't enough that they were trying to erase her family's legacy. They were doing it quickly and with alarming efficiency. Her world, the one she had fought so hard to preserve, was beginning to collapse. But she couldn't let that happen. Not now. Not when she was so close to uncovering the truth. That night, as Eliza sat in her grandmother's house, the once familiar walls now feeling alien and cold, she knew that she had to make a choice. She couldn't fight this battle alone anymore. The evidence that David had uncovered was powerful, but it was also dangerous. If they went public with it, if they exposed the corruption within the homeowners association, they would make powerful enemies who would stop at nothing to protect their interests. And yet, the idea of sitting back and allowing the demolition of her family's home, the home that had been in her family for generations, was unbearable. She could feel the weight of her grandmother's legacy on her shoulders. Joyce had never backed down, and neither would she. But Eliza also knew that this battle was far from straightforward. She needed allies. She needed people who would stand beside her, not just in support of her home, but for the community as a whole. The next morning, Eliza reached out to some of the neighbors she had spoken to earlier. She asked them to meet her at the local community center to discuss their options. When she arrived, she was surprised to see a larger turnout than she expected. Several families from around the neighborhood had come, and they were all willing to stand with her. They shared their own stories of how the homeowners association had pressured them into making costly improvements to their homes, or how they had been harassed into selling. It was clear that Eliza wasn't alone. The association had made enemies, and now those enemies were ready to fight back. With the support of her neighbors, Eliza felt a renewed sense of determination. Together, they could expose the corruption within the homeowners association. They could show the world that this wasn't just about her grandmother's house, it was about saving the entire neighborhood from becoming another piece of gentrified land. But even with this newfound resolve, Eliza knew that the next steps would be fraught with danger. She wasn't just challenging a local body of power, she was challenging a deeply entrenched system that had been operating for years, manipulating the rules to serve the interests of a few, while disregarding the rights of those who had lived in the area for decades. As the days passed, Eliza and her neighbors organized. They collected evidence, documented their stories, and prepared to go public. They knew that the stakes were higher than ever, but they were no longer afraid. The truth was on their side, and together they were going to make sure that their voices were heard. But Eliza also knew that the association wasn't going to give up easily. They had powerful connections, and they would stop at nothing to protect their financial interests. This was a fight that was only just beginning, and Eliza couldn't afford to make a mistake. She had to stay sharp, stay focused, and most importantly, stay true to the values her grandmother had instilled in her. The time for hesitation was over. Eliza was ready to take on the homeowners association, but she knew that the true battle had just begun. As Eliza sat in her living room, sorting through the piles of documents she had accumulated, the weight of the situation seemed to press in on her from every direction. The battle she had started to save her grandmother's house was no longer just a legal dispute. It had escalated into something much larger, something that was testing her resolve in ways she hadn't anticipated. The homeowners association had begun to retaliate in earnest, and their tactics had shifted from bureaucratic pressure to something far more aggressive. The first signs of this new strategy came one afternoon when Eliza received an unexpected phone call. David, her lawyer, was on the line, his voice tense and urgent. "Eliza, they've filed an injunction against you. They're pushing for an immediate court order to begin demolition, claiming that your house is an imminent safety hazard. The city is already moving forward with it. If we don't act fast, it could be too late." Eliza felt her heart skip a beat. The association had been relentless, But this was different. They had moved from paperwork to taking real action. Her worst fears were coming true. The house she had fought so hard to protect was now just days away from being torn down, and it felt like everything she had done so far was slipping away from her grasp. The ground beneath her seemed to shift, and for a moment Eliza wasn't sure how much longer she could hold on. She had always believed in the power of truth, of standing up for what was right, but she was beginning to wonder if it was enough. She couldn't lose the house, not now, not after everything her grandmother had gone through to make it a home. David's voice snapped her back to the present. "We're going to file an emergency motion to block the demolition, but we need more. The evidence you have about the association's corruption is solid, but we need to connect the dots. We need to prove that this isn't just about your house. It's about a larger conspiracy to manipulate property values and push out homeowners who don't fit their ideal of the neighborhood. And, Eliza, we can't do this alone. We need the media involved." Eliza wasn't sure how much more she could take, but she knew David was right. The association wasn't just fighting her. They were fighting the entire community. This was about more than just one house. It was about the future of the neighborhood, about the future of every person who had ever called it home. The corruption she had uncovered was bigger than she could have imagined, and now, with the threat of demolition hanging over her, she realized the true nature of the battle she was facing. That evening, after hanging up with David, Eliza sat alone in her grandmother's house, the silence oppressive. The house had always been a place of comfort, but now it felt like a battleground. As she stared at the walls, the memories of her grandmother seemed to fade, replaced by a cold realization. The fight wasn't just for the house, it was for the spirit of everything that had come before her. Joyce had fought against the very forces Eliza was now confronting, and her legacy was at stake. If Eliza lost this battle, she wouldn't just lose the house, she would lose the connection to everything her family had worked for. The next day, Eliza contacted several local reporters, hoping that the media would take an interest in her case. She had always been a private person, never one for the spotlight, but she knew now that it was her only option. She needed the public to see what was really happening, to understand that this was about more than just a single property. The fight was bigger than she had ever imagined, and if she could rally the community behind her, maybe, just maybe, they could make a difference. When the reporter arrived, Eliza didn't hold back. She spoke of the Homeowners Association's actions, of the corruption she had uncovered, and of the threat to the very fabric of the neighborhood. As she spoke, she realized how much of herself she was putting on the line. There was no turning back now. Over the following days, the media began to take an interest in the story. News outlets picked up the coverage, and the story of Eliza's fight spread like wildfire. It wasn't just about a house anymore. It was about the fight for the soul of the community, about standing up to the powerful forces that had manipulated the system for their own gain. Eliza became a symbol of resistance, and soon she wasn't alone. Neighbors who had once been too afraid to speak out came forward, sharing their own stories of how the Homeowners Association had tried to force them into selling or making costly improvements to their homes. The association's reputation began to crumble as more and more people joined Eliza's cause. But as Eliza's public profile grew, so did the opposition. The Homeowners Association wasn't going to let her challenge their power without a fight. They began to turn the pressure up, using every legal and financial tactic at their disposal to intimidate her and her supporters. Eliza received more threatening letters, warning her to stop speaking out or face serious consequences. Contractors who had been scheduled to do work on her house began to back out, unwilling to risk their reputations by being associated with her case. It was clear that the association was doing everything they could to make her feel isolated, to make her feel as though she was fighting a losing battle. As if to underscore their determination, one afternoon, Eliza received a call from an unknown number. The voice on the other end was low and threatening, almost a whisper. "You're making a big mistake, Eliza," the voice said. "You have no idea who you're up against. If you keep going, You're going to lose everything. We're not just going to take your house. We're going to make sure you regret ever stepping into this fight." Eliza's hands shook as she held the phone to her ear. The threats were no longer veiled. They were real, and they were aimed directly at her. But instead of cowering, something inside Eliza snapped. The fear she had felt at the beginning of this journey had been replaced with something else. A fierce determination. She wasn't going to back down. She wasn't going to let them destroy everything her grandmother had fought for, everything she had worked so hard to protect. That night, Eliza sat at her kitchen table staring at the pile of evidence and legal papers spread out before her. She had come too far to turn back now. She had the support of her neighbors, the attention of the media, and the evidence to prove the corruption within the homeowners association. She wasn't going to let their threats scare her. She was going to fight, and this time she was going to win. The next day, David filed an emergency motion to block the demolition, and Eliza knew that the fight was far from over. But this time, she was ready. She would stand firm, no matter the cost. The stakes had never been higher, but neither had her resolve. The Homeowners Association had made a grave mistake in underestimating her. Now, with the community behind her and the truth on her side, Eliza was ready to take them on. The battle was just beginning, and she would not back down. Not now, not ever. The day Eliza walked into the courtroom, she felt as though the weight of the entire neighborhood rested on her shoulders. The media had gathered outside, cameras flashing as reporters waited for the latest twist in the battle over her grandmother's house. It had become a symbol of resistance against the growing tide of development, corruption, and the erosion of community identity. Eliza had fought so hard to get to this point, but now, with everything on the line, the reality of what she was about to face felt more overwhelming than ever. The courtroom was quiet, and she could hear the sound of her own heartbeat as she stepped to the front with David, her lawyer. The judge was already seated, and the opposing counsel for the Homeowners Association stood with a smug look on his face. It was clear they had come prepared to do whatever it took to make sure Eliza lost. They had a long history of getting what they wanted, and Eliza knew that today they wouldn't give up easily. She glanced at the gallery where her neighbors sat, some nervously shifting in their seats, others looking determined, their eyes filled with a shared sense of hope. They were all here because they believed in her, in the fight for something more than just a piece of property. It was a fight for their collective future. Eliza straightened her back and focused on the task at hand. This was it. This was the moment that would define everything. The judge called the court to order, and the proceedings began. The Homeowners Association's lawyer was the first to present his case, outlining how Eliza's property was a nuisance and a safety hazard, reiterating the claims that the house violated aesthetic standards and posed risks to the surrounding homes. He presented an array of documents, photographs, and supposed expert testimony that painted Eliza's home as an eyesore, one that needed to be demolished to maintain the integrity of the neighborhood. The argument was so rehearsed, so standard, that it felt like they had been waiting for this moment to unfold. The association's lawyer finished with a flourish, confident that he had made a compelling case. Eliza could see the smirk on his face as he turned to face the judge. It was as though he believed the decision was already made, but he had underestimated her. When it was Eliza's turn, she stood tall, the weight of her grandmother's legacy giving her strength. She began with a calm, measured tone, recounting the history of her family in this neighborhood, the love and care her grandmother had poured into the house, and the respect she had always shown for the community. She then pivoted, speaking directly to the corruption she had uncovered within the Homeowners Association, outlining the secret deals they had struck with developers, the manipulation of the property values, and the systematic pressure they had placed on residents to conform to their vision of the neighborhood. The association, she explained, wasn't interested in preserving the neighborhood. They were interested in replacing it with something more profitable. She presented the evidence David had uncovered, pointing to the fraudulent documents, the illegal zoning changes, and the financial ties between the association's leadership and the developers who stood to benefit from the destruction of her home. Eliza's voice shook with emotion as she spoke, but she refused to be silenced. She was telling the truth, and the truth had power. As she spoke, Eliza saw the judge's face change. At first, he had been impassive, but now there was something else in his eyes, a glimmer of understanding, perhaps even a hint of concern. Her words were resonating with him. She had come prepared, not just with legal documents, but with a story that transcended property lines and zoning laws. She wasn't just fighting for her house, she was fighting for the soul of the community, for the preservation of everything her grandmother had worked to build. This wasn't just about aesthetics or regulations, it was about justice. Eliza's case wasn't just about saving a single house. It was about standing up to a system that prioritized profit over people, that tore down history in the name of progress. She spoke for the people who had been silenced by the Homeowners Association, for the families who had been forced out, for the history that was being erased in the name of development. When she finished, there was a long silence in the courtroom. The judge looked over the documents, his brow furrowed in thought. Eliza held her breath, the tension in the room palpable. It felt like the entire future of the neighborhood was hanging in the balance, and yet, for the first time, Eliza felt a sense of peace. She had done everything she could. She had fought with every ounce of her being, and now it was in the hands of the court. After what felt like an eternity, the judge spoke. His voice was calm, but there was an unmistakable authority behind it. The evidence presented here today raises serious questions about the legitimacy of the Homeowners Association's actions, he began, his gaze sweeping across the room. This case is about more than just one property. It's about fairness, about the rights of individuals to protect their homes from unjust practices and manipulation. After careful consideration, I am issuing a temporary injunction against the Homeowners Association. The demolition order will be suspended pending further investigation into the allegations of corruption and illegal activity. A wave of relief washed over Eliza. It wasn't a full victory yet, but it was a step in the right direction. The Homeowners Association had lost their immediate claim to demolish the house, and for the first time since this nightmare began, Eliza felt like they were on the verge of winning. The judge ordered a full investigation into the association's practices, and the media coverage of the case only intensified after the ruling. Eliza knew that this was just the beginning. The investigation could take months, even years, but for now, the most immediate threat to her home had been removed. And in that moment, as she stood outside the courthouse surrounded by her neighbors, her friends, and the reporters who had been covering the case, Eliza felt a deep sense of accomplishment. She had taken on one of the most powerful forces in the neighborhood and come out on top, at least for now. But Eliza knew that this battle was far from over. The Homeowners Association wasn't going to go down without a fight, and their reach extended far beyond this one case. But that didn't matter. For the first time, Eliza felt a sense of unity with the people around her. She wasn't alone. She had her community, and together they were going to ensure that the story of her grandmother's house, and the story of their neighborhood, wouldn't be erased. The real fight was just beginning, but Eliza was ready for it. She had already proven that she could stand up to the powerful forces that had been trying to tear down everything she loved. And now, more than ever, she was prepared to see it through to the end. In the months that followed the court's decision to halt the demolition, the atmosphere in the neighborhood changed. What had once been a quiet street gripped by silent tension had turned into a place where people spoke openly, shared their frustrations, and, more importantly, supported one another. Eliza, who never imagined herself in the role of a public figure, became a quiet force in the background, still focused on restoring her grandmother's house, still grieving the emotional toll of everything she'd been through, but no longer alone in her fight. The investigation into the Homeowners Association revealed a deeply rooted network of financial misconduct, abuse of authority, and backdoor agreements with developers, and though it would take time for all the consequences to fully unfold, The weight of public scrutiny had permanently shaken the foundation of their power. Key figures resigned, others disappeared from the public eye, and the association's credibility was damaged beyond repair. The threat of demolition was no longer hanging over Eliza's head, and for the first time since the ordeal began, she could breathe. She spent her days repairing what had been neglected during the months of battle, repainting cracked walls, clearing out debris, restoring the garden that had once been her grandmother's